Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show That Time When. I'm your host, Will Newhall, and you're listening to YurtRadio.
And today we are going to be talking about utensils. Well, actually, we're going to be talking about the table that you're probably nearby right now. Not just the table itself, but also the utensils on it, the food that goes on it, and things like that. That's right. We're talking about your dinner. So sit down, relax, take out some nice macaroni and cheese, and eat it while you listen to me lecture all about these weird historical facts. Alright, so what's the first thing we're going to cover? Well, obviously we're going to cover one of the most important and significant tools in human history. That is to say, the knife. The knife is one of the oldest implements that humans use. It's one of the oldest tools. We use it all the time for absolutely everything, or at least back then we used to. Nowadays we just use it to, cut stuff. But back then you could use it as a shovel. People would use it as a shovel. People would use it to cut open wounds, to fix broken bones, to do all kinds of things. It served multiple purposes. It originally appeared in prehistoric tribes, and if you think about it, blades were very useful tools, because one of the things they did was they replaced your teeth. Your teeth, the front two teeth, are designed to cut. The teeth next to it are your canines, are designed to grip, and the rest are used to mush down things. But prehistoric peoples would use their teeth for other things, like, cracking open a nut or something like that. So, when they came up with the knife, they were able to use that for those same purposes. The knife continued on into civilization and improved with the Iron and Bronze Ages, and it became better and more effective as a tool for cutting and doing things with. Just all around, just doing things. Over time, knives began to grow bigger in the forms of spears and swords as far as war was concerned, but overall, the knife, as we know it, stayed pretty much the same for a long period of time, although, it became more diverse over time as there were different knives for different purposes. Knives continued to improve and change, taking the forms of surgical tools, kitchen knives, and essentially early all-purpose knives. You can even see kind of like early Swiss Army knives. In a lot of human history, it wasn't uncommon, especially in medieval Europe, for people to bring their own knives to dinner for cutting food along with other cutlery. The spoon is another very important table utensil that I'm sure you're aware of. But unlike the knife, historians aren't sure exactly where it came. Archaeologists have found spoons that appeared maybe 3,000 years ago in Egypt, but we're not sure if that's where it started. Anyway, spoons and other spoon-like tools are found all across the world, from the use of shells as spoons to something closer to what we would find at our dinner tables. It kind of depends on where and when you're looking. Because if you think about it, something like shells are, can be used for the same purpose a spoon is used. So why would you create a spoon if you already have the tools? So what we define as a spoon might not be what other cultures might consider a spoon, and so on. That doesn't really make sense. But you get my point. Spoons were often used as tools in the form of shovels, or in the case of mummies and surgery, scooping out various parts of the body. In particular, the brain. The Egyptians didn't believe that brains actually served any anatomical purpose. They thought they were just junk. So when they were mummifying a body, they would take out the heart and the stomach and the lungs, and they would put those in canopic jars. But with the brain, they would essentially take a spoon, stick it up the dead person's nose, and then scoop out bits of brain as that fell down. And if you are eating your food right now, I sincerely apologize to your table, and you, and probably your pants at the moment. Anyway, moving on. The type of tablespoon that that you use now for your cereal came around in Tudor England in the 16th century Europe, and as far as table manners are concerned, has essentially stayed that way. It's essentially been the same. I mean, we've come up with other spoons, like the spoon used for scooping up, I don't know, soup, probably came before that if you think about it. But nonetheless, now that we have discovered how the spoon came around, let us discuss the fork. The history of the fork is different from the histories of these other two implements because even compared to the spoon, it's less clear when it appears because, a spoon can be defined as really anything that works as like a shovel-ish type of tool, and those have existed for a long time. But a fork is a piercing implement. You could define a piercing implement as almost anything. You could consider a spear a fork if you logic it out enough. But for our purposes, we are going to define a fork as we now use it, a 3 or 4 pronged instrument used for spearing food. The use of a 2-pronged fork, similar to today's carving fork, for spearing food first appeared in Europe with Catherine de' Medici in the 16th century, who was going to marry the French King Henry II. See, the interesting thing about the de' Medici family is that they were these Italian bankers, and they were important because they were powerful, extremely powerful. They weren't royalty by any means. They didn't really have much political power, except that they had a hell of a lot of money. At their peak, they had, they were just the biggest bank in all of Europe. And for them, they were kind of classy. When Catherine de' Medici married the French King Henry II, she saw these people as uncivilized. It's because they didn't have quite the same table manners. So she decided, you know what? I'm going to teach these, she viewed them as savages, how to use their manners and be classy and just all around act more human in her mind. So she went about that by setting up tables in a more orderly fashion, bringing in implements, teaching people how to use forks and knives. Plates were also an important benefit. And, more or less teaching people how to use a fork and a knife and a spoon. Catherine brought with her a lot of other customs, but we might end up covering that either later today or in the show. Kind of depends. In another show. Kind of depends on where we go from here. The fork as we know it, with 3 to 4 tines, appears almost a century later as people begin to purchase sets of cutlery for the, at this time, new concept of a dining room, which is very similar to what we have now. See, previously, what was a dining room then was a lot more like a great hall. Kind of like how in Hogwarts they described the Great Hall as this just magically massive building. That was essentially what the dining room was. That was the Great Hall. You would have, in the medieval times, you would have the lordship and their servants and so on eating with their serfs. It was just kind of a communal thing. A separation between serfs and lords didn't really start until later with the serfs' tables being set specifically lower than the lords' tables. But I digress. I'm getting off topic. Yes, so new concept of a dining room very similar to what we have now. In fact, in the 1700s, it was possible to have a Swiss Army knife of table utensils with a knife and fork attached to one handle that could be folded. And these were real things. One of the things is that in around this time, really until fairly recently, and by fairly recently, like 200 years ago, if you went to dinner, you often brought your own cutlery with you. And before even that, before people commonly used forks and spoons, if you were like a visiting noble or visiting for dinner, it was kind of taken for granted that you would have your own knife with you. It was just a thing, because knives were such all utilitarian tools. So in the 1700s, once dining implements start to become more and more common, you start to see these Swiss Army knife type of dining implements that could be carried around easily, compacted, and so on. With the appearance of the fork as we know it, we also start to see table manners appearing. Catherine de' Medici traveled around Europe teaching people about table manners that she'd learned in her hometown of Florence, Italy. She didn't just do it in her, new home of France. She actually traveled all across Europe. She viewed the French, English, Spanish, German, and others' eating habits as barbaric, and several of these people mocked the idea of using a fork at first. But Catherine de' Medici kept working and eventually prevailed. In much of Europe, especially Northern Europe, dining tables weren't much more than a board over a trestle, which was then draped with a cloth. Thus the expression set the table. The aforementioned cloth was used as a hand wipe for diners, since most of the food they ate classified as finger food at the time. It's a common misconception that tablecloths first appeared, because Victorians saw table legs as promiscuous. In reality, they existed long before then. Utensils like knives, spoons, and cups were shared communally, and soup was drunk, usually straight from the bowl. But anyway, moving on to the history of tablecloths. Yes, what you know about the idea of Victorian tablecloth is not true. That never actually was true. It just, it's actually a lot different from that. And we'll talk about how we come to the idea of the history of the tablecloth as a sex symbol. So tablecloths first appeared as early as 103 AD, where the Roman author Martial mentions them in his poetry. And I have to say, having read Martial's work, he's kind of funny. Anyway, some tables in Rome were quite fancy, so some Romans would opt to not have a tablecloth, but then again, the benefit of a tablecloth was that you could avoid having too much of a mess. So some people would use very simple tablecloths. According to legend, the first Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne had a tablecloth of asbestos, which he would throw in the fire after dinner. It would not burn, so he would use this literal parlor trick to show off his pure holiness and power to his guests. See, Charlemagne was made the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope as part of like a power scheme. In fact, I think this is Charlemagne, but it might also be Napoleon. According to legend, the Pope was kind of coerced into declaring him the Holy Roman Emperor, and when Charlemagne came to the ceremony, he essentially asked the Pope to make him the Holy Roman Emperor. But when Charlemagne came to the ceremony, the Pope was like, "And I now declare you the Holy Roman Emperor." And Charlemagne was like, "Oh no, I can't possibly accept. Really, this is too much of a heavy responsibility." And the Pope was like, "Okay, well, you wanted this." But then Charlemagne, just according to legend, grabbed the crown from the Pope and was like, "Yeah, no, I want this. Give it to me." I guess he just kind of. Guess that's not the first time a world leader acts like a child. But yes, he would use this literal parlor trick to show off his holiness and divine power to his guests, to try and wow them into making him king, essentially. As time progressed, as it usually does, most households began to use the tablecloth as just a normal, just typical thing, except for the very poor, of course, who could not afford an asbestos tablecloth. The tablecloth, for a while, was a display of wealth and power. The fancier the tablecloth, the richer one was. Kind of like how we view cars today, so if you can imagine the Lamborghini of tablecloths. The whiter the tablecloth, the better, because it meant that you had more people to clean the tablecloth for you. See? Yeah? The cleaner it looks, the better it looks. As time progressed, the use of the tablecloth as a status symbol increased. People would have them custom made and use them to try and flaunt their power over their neighbors. Some even had servants whose entire job was to maintain the tablecloth. That was the sole and only purpose. At least it's not as bad as the pharaoh's personal gastroenterologist, who I believe was literally classified as the servant of the anus, and his job, the servant's specific job, was to wipe the pharaoh's anus. Anyway, moving on. I believe that's true. I think I might be right. Might be wrong, but we'll see about that. So, now on to Victorian tablecloth sex. How did we come up with this idea of Victorian tablecloth and sex? As you probably already guessed, and I've probably already told you, this idea was actually false. While it's true that people tended to drape their furniture, it was actually to preserve it from damage, not to, hide the legs. Where does this idea of sexy furniture come from? Well, historians believe that this idea of sexy furniture actually came from the journal log of a British naval officer in the early 1800s who was exploring America. He created it as a way to mock what he viewed as American prudishness. This idea took off like wildfire. Charles Dickens actually mentions it in I believe it's called Martin Chuzzlewit, with the phrase, the naked eye. Yes, that is correct. When you talk about someone seeing something with the naked eye, they are referencing Victorian table sex, which actually wasn't a thing in the first place. But this idea of American prudishness kind of ended up biting the British in the butt because people expanded the idea to include the entire Victorian upper class rather than just the Americans. In fact, it was especially English. Who has egg on their face now, am I right? I mean, literally, you could end up with egg on your face if you had dinner with a bad noble person. Anyway, I digress. By the 20th century, this had taken off at the idea of Victorian tablecloth sex had taken on a life of its own. It was officially a commonly held misconception. The tablecloth became a common part of a household as America began to catch up to the rest of the Western world with industrialization. Tablecloths became became cheaper and cheaper as they began to be made by machines rather than the custom-made ones previously. So they started to become more of a typical household thing, because more people are able to afford them. And now they have become what they are now, the implement used for dogs to hide under the kitchen table and for puppies to declare war on furniture. So, there's that. So, I promised we were going to talk about the history of food. And we are going to do that, but we're not going to cover all food because that would take me absolutely forever, and I just don't want to spend that much time on it. So, instead, we are going to focus on specific foods. The first of these foods being coffee. Coffee has an interesting history. According to legend, it was first noticed in Ethiopia when a goat herder saw his goats eating these berries from a bush and refusing to sleep at night. They had so much energy it was remarkable. This goat herder then reported this to the local abbot, who, upon consuming the berries, realized he could go through evening prayer and still have energy for more. This spread around the monastery and later the town, then on to the rest of the country. Soon it spread to other countries all across the Middle East. Once it came to the Arabian Peninsula, it took root in their coffee houses, and coffee houses began to spring up. And this became a staple in many households in the area. At one point, it became so popular, one Muslim priest tried to get it banned because he thought it equivalent to alcohol, which was banned in the Quran. He lost this case simply because coffee was just too popular. In another case, in 1511, the leader of Mecca banned coffee because he believed that it would stimulate radical thinking and hanging out, which might then unite his opposition. and no one wants that. God forbid someone express an opposing opinion. As it spread into Europe, it played a major role in the European Enlightenment. See, the European Enlightenment started around the same time as coffee came to Europe, that is to say, the 1600s. At first, there was some hesitancy with people calling it the quote-unquote bitter invention of Satan. This got so serious that at one point the Pope at the time, Pope Clement VIII, was asked to intervene. He tasted the beverage and liked it so much that he gave it papal approval. He also joked at one point that perhaps it should be baptized. Coffee houses became centers in Europe, became centers of intellectual discussion, much like how they had become centers of intellectual discussion in the Middle East. People would gather at these coffee houses, buy drinks, and discuss ideas. Around this time, too, Europe begins its notorious expansion with colonialism. Once Europe has been cut off from the spice trade with India, Europe took it upon themselves to get their spices another way. This later turns into colonialism, as it's often referred to, with Christopher Columbus and the Americas. But that's a discussion for a completely different time. Although, if you think about it, European colonialism with Christopher Columbus sounds like it could be a really weird reality TV show. No, not really reality TV show. I guess late night talk show. Westward Expansion with Christopher Columbus. Ahoy there! Let us discuss, the current events of today in the late 1600s, or actually no, it would be 1400s. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then proceeded to massacre a large number of Taino people. 1492. So ahoy there, 1492. Anyway, before I continue on this tangent, coffee houses became centers of intellectual discussion in Europe. People would gather at these coffee houses, buy drinks, and discuss ideas. Around this time, too, Europe begins its notorious expansion of colonialism. Once Europe had been cut off from the spice trade with India, Europe took it upon themselves to get their spices another way. This later turns into colonialism, as it's often referred to with Christopher Columbus and the Americas. But that's a discussion for a different time. For now, just know that coffee came around the same time as these events, which is why I would argue that coffee is responsible for the Enlightenment and perhaps its collateral damage as well. But that's something that's an idea I still need to punch out. In fact, coffee was given the axe in Europe at only one point, and not for very long. In Sweden, the government banned coffee cups, dishes, and anything else that could possibly be used to brew, sell, or consume coffee. The king at the time, King Gustav III, even ordered convicted murderers to drink coffee while doctors monitored them to see how long it would take for them to die. Obviously, this did not quite pan out the way the monarchy thought it would. I should also note, despite coffee's effect on European expansion, coffee wasn't really accepted in the American colonies until 1773, when the American colonists decided to drink coffee instead of tea, in protest of Britain's tea tax. Around the same time, on the other side of the Western world, Frederick the Great of Prussia tried to ban coffee and convince people to drink beer instead. It really didn't work. But he tried, so, I guess it's the effort that counts. By the end of the 18th century, coffee had a firm foothold in the world market and was produced and sold on many continents all across the world, and has since then just continued to grow. So, what else do you consume in the morning besides coffee? Well, if you're like me, you do like your morning breakfast to have eggs in it. Eggs are a staple of many dishes, especially pastries and really anything that involves breakfast. But how did they get here? Why do we eat them? Well, fun fact, there are over 200 different breeds of chicken. I know, something you did not expect you would learn today. But, anyway, birds like these were hunted over 10,000 years ago, and their eggs were often consumed as a delicacy in prehistoric, pre-civilization times. Historians believe that chickens and other wild fowl began to be domesticated around 3200 BCE in India. For those who do not spend their time thinking about the past, that's almost 5,000 years ago. Records from Egypt and China show that domesticated chickens first appeared a lot sooner in 1400 BCE, though some believe it was even earlier in 6000 BCE. For Europe, it was even later, with domesticated hens appearing as early as 600 BCE. So Europe was kind of, behind the times. But that they weren't late enough for the Romans to not... Wait. The ancient Romans... Let me back up. The ancient Romans would regularly eat eggs as part of their meals, and would crush the shells to ward off evil spirits. Of course, no better way to ward off evil spirits than crushing eggshells. A lot of the egg dishes we like to eat now are thousands of years old, like the dish itself, not the eggs. Please don't eat thousand-year-old eggs. That would be horrifically gross, and probably smell like sulfur. Well, actually, yeah, sulfur smells like rotten eggs, so yeah, I guess that makes sense. Anyway, for example, ancient Egyptian nobility and priests would boil their eggs, poach them, or fry them. Romans would boil their eggs and then add certain sauces and flavors to them. They would have them in pine nut sauce, in roux, tuna, or anchovies, or even in vinegar. That almost sounded like Dr. Seuss. No, Julius Caesar, I will not have vinegar with my egg, nor tuna, nor anchovy, nor pine nut sauce. In fact, they even scrambled eggs and made omelets out of them. So, next time you're having scrambled eggs for breakfast, you can thank the Romans. In fact, eggs were so common that they were a staple for many medieval Europeans on account of the fact that they were so cheap. It also doesn't hurt that they have a lot of protein in them. During the Renaissance, the Italians would decorate and garnish their salads with eggs, much like we see now in modern culinary delights. King Louis XV of France would eat a soft-boiled egg every Sunday. Normally this isn't important, but this was so, I guess, significant to the French that people would even come to watch him eat his egg, and a court officer would announce the event by saying that the king is about to eat his egg. Imagine a whole group captivated by the art of eating an egg and clapping at its completion. This is what happened. I guess eating an egg is what really gives life meaning. Anyway, in the 1800s, how to cook an egg even became parts of common household maintenance and etiquette books. Early American colonials even had recipes for preserving eggs. Some would use 1 pint of coarse salt, 1 pint of unslacked lime, to a pail full of water. Others suggested burying them in charcoal after greasing them with mutton oil. Others still included putting them in lard. But yes, sorry to gross you out with charcoal and egg. Moving on to sandwiches. Now, I'm sure you think you know about sandwich history, but let me tell you, you only know part of the story of sandwich history. Now that you know all there is to know about eggs, let's move on to sandwiches. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, sandwiches are defined as an item of food consisting of 2 pieces of bread with meat, cheese, or other filling between them, eaten as a light meal. You may be thinking, but Will, I already know the history of sandwiches. They were invented like 300 years ago by the Lord of Sandwich or something like that. Wrong. Well, actually, technically you're right, but also you're wrong. Allow me to explain. See, the modern view of a sandwich or sub first appeared in 18th century Europe. But there are older versions of these. An ancient Jewish leader known as Hillel the Elder supposedly would wrap meat and herbs in matzah bread during Passover. Versions of this actually still exist in Moroccan, Ethiopian, and even Indian cuisine. If you get the chance to eat some Moroccan cuisine, do it. It is so good. Anyway, in the Middle Ages, bread, usually stale bread, would be used by people as plates. These were called trenchers. After the meal had been consumed, people would then feed the food-soaked trencher to the dogs. But I suppose if they were really starving, they might actually just eat it themselves. Anyway. Oh, that would be kind of nice to have a nice bit of sourdough bread as your plate. Oh, that would make it delicious. In fact, in the Netherlands, people would butter their bread and then lay a thin slice of meat on it. Kind of like an early ham sandwich. Just add some lettuce, tomato, and you essentially have a half-produced BLT. Now we're going to talk about the Lord of Sandwich, or we're going to get back to the Lord of Sandwich. Well, actually, He was the Earl of Sandwich, if we're going to be technical here. Supposedly, he would order his servant to send him a meal stuck between two pieces of bread so that he could eat while playing cards and not get his cards dirty, nor have to really look away from his cards. This cuisine really took off among people once industrialization started to hit the Western world. This is because sandwiches are fast and easy to make and carry, as I'm sure we all know, at least if you know how to make a sandwich. They're also really quick to eat. That way, when you're working at the cotton mill, you don't have to spend your precious time eating your food, when you could really just be working at the cotton mill. I mean, really, come on. Focus on what you're doing, okay? Who cares about eating? Food? What? Nobody eats that. Anyway, moving on. Now that we mentioned the 1800s of food, I would be quite annoyed with myself if I did not take the time to mention one of the world's true delights, pizza. You also may be wondering at this point, Will, why are we talking about food? Well, my beloved listener, 'tis because I am hungry. Anyway, back to talking about pizza. Now, pizza as we would know it first appeared in Italy in 1889. It was called the Pizza Margherita. It was called this because it was commissioned by the Italian nobility who were having a visit from the esteemed Queen Margherita. The pizza chef made 3 different pizzas, and the Queen chose the one in the colors of the Italian flag: basil, mozzarella, and tomato, or what we now call a Margherita pizza. In fact, there is an actual letter placed in the shop which produced these pizzas, which is now called Pizzeria Brandy, that is from the Queen's, advisor or something? Yeah, the Queen's chief advisor, I think, that talks about, just this pizza and how it is the official pizza of Italy, and so on. Anyway, that said, foods that are very weirdly similar to pizza have appeared as early as the Neolithic age. In fact, in the 6th century BCE, Persian soldiers would cook pieces of flat bread with cheese and dates on top of their shields, while they were at war. The ancient Greeks would also make similar flatbreads with oils, herbs, and cheese. My mother actually made this type of recipe this summer and called it her new invention. Hate to burst your bubble, Mother, but the Greeks came up with it first. Sorry. Much like many other things that are branded as American, quote-unquote, pizza was brought to America by immigrants. Americans would then take it upon themselves to come up with new ideas for flavors and concepts. That is actually how we come with the monstrosity of diabetes that is the macaroni and cheese pizza. That's it. Let's talk about our next and final topic, macaroni and cheese. Macaroni and cheese is a staple of American culture. From Kraft mac and cheese to Annie's, we love the dish. As most good quality Western cuisine comes from, it first appeared in the 1300s in an Italian cookbook called the Liber di Cucina, I think. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. Which mentioned a dish of composed of parmesan and noodles. The English also had a version of this dish with a cheese and pasta casserole called macaroons, which I also don't know if that's correct. The recipe is translated as follows. Make a thin sheet of dough and cut it into pieces. Place them in boiling water and boil them well. Take cheese and grate it and add it and place butter beneath it and above, as with a dish similar to lasagna, and serve. However, no recipe that is quite similar to what we now call macaroni and cheese existed until Elizabeth Raffles' book, Rudolph. She is not a red-nosed reindeer. Elizabeth Raffles' book. This book was called The Experienced English Housekeeper, which was published in 1770. The recipe called for cheddar cheese and parmesan to be baked with macaroni until it's all bubbly and golden. If you're wondering what Elizabeth Raffles was like, think Martha Stewart of the 18th century, except without the prison time. Thomas Jefferson actually came across macaroni and cheese in France when he was ambassador there, and liked it so much that he actually brought it back with him and served it at a state dinner in 1802. The reason we know this weirdly specific fact is because one of the guests, Reverend Manasseh Cutler, hated it so much that he decided to actually write it down. like a written version of someone screaming into a void, "I hate mac and cheese!" Although I suspect that today, any person who suggested such an obscene idea would probably be picked up and thrown into said void. Soon after this, it started to become a common recipe in cookbooks, and as the dish spread, it lost its special stately approval, and around 1850 to the early 1900s, it became the amazing and delicious dish we see today. So yeah, that is your history of macaroni and cheese. Thank you for listening to my show. I hope you learned something, and hopefully I will see you Monday. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye for now.
This has been That Time When. Keep doing kooky things so that in 100 years, people like me can talk about them. Bye for now.